Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Thoreau, and I'm the president of the Independent Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to this live stream panel forum to respond to the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco. The event has been organized by the Heartland Institute and is being held here in the Independent Institute's Conference Center in Oakland, California. Leading our panel is James Taylor, who is Senior Fellow for Environment and Energy Policy at the Heartland Institute. James studied atmospheric science at Dartmouth College and received his J.D. from Syracuse University. A columnist at Forbes, he has appeared on CNN, Fox News Channel, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, PBS, and elsewhere, and his many articles have appeared in newspapers across the U.S. Thank you for joining with us. James?
Partnership that we've had this week, lining up this rebuttal here at the Independent Institute in the San Francisco Bay Area. At the Heartland Institute, when we saw that the Global Climate Action Summit was in the works, we were very concerned that there would not be a presentation of science that reflected reality. And we feel it's very important that science drive the discussion and ultimately the politics, if there are to be politics surrounding the issue, not the other way around. So what we have done today is we have brought together a small group of scientists and policy experts so that you can get the full story, not just the partial story that you're receiving at the Moscone Center where the Global Climate Action Summit is. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panelists. To my immediate right is Dr. Jay Lehr. Dr. Lehr is the science director at the Heartland Institute. He received, I believe it's the nation's first groundwater hydrology Ph.D., and he's a Princeton man. He knows his stuff. That's why he's here with the Heartland Institute. That's why he's on the panel. Next to him, we have Dr. Terry Gannon. Dr. Gannon is a Ph.D. scientist with a background in physics, device physics in particular. He also studies climate science, and he is a research fellow here at the Independent Institute. Next to him, we have Stan Goldenberg. Stan is a meteorologist based in Miami, Florida. And besides being a meteorologist, Stan is one of the gentlemen who flies aircraft into the eye walls of hurricanes in order to provide the wind speeds and other hurricane data that the federal government needs for the most accurate hurricane forecasts and reports. And finally, at the end of the table, well, I guess we have two more. We have Dr. Richard Keene, who is an instructor emeritus in meteorology and in climate science at the University of Colorado. And at the end of the table, we have Tom Harris. Tom is an engineer. He is also the president of the International Climate Science Coalition. And as we begin today's discussion and what we've set up to be a rebuttal, I think it's worth noting that if you've been watching the Global Climate Action Summit, emphasis, I guess, should be on the word action, not science, not climate, because there's been very little, if any, science discussed. The closest that we've seen would be a politician or two referencing drought or Hurricane Florence and attributing them to global warming without providing any data, scientific theories, explanations, or observations. And this is really the difference between what we have on the two sides of this discussion. We have science and observations on one side, and that's the skeptic side, and we have theories, speculation that have been not only unsupported by scientific data, but contradicted by sound scientific data. And with that, because Hurricane Florence is in the news right now, and it has been brought up many times at the Global Climate Action Summit this morning, I'd like to turn the microphone over first to Stan, who can hopefully give us an update on Hurricane Florence and maybe bring in some of the climate science aspects that have been speculated about this hurricane in the media.
Well, first of all, Hurricane Florence is about to make landfall on the Carolina coast and it's going to affect North Carolina, South Carolina, rain affecting states inland for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And as people know, just a few days ago, I'm going to bring this into climate in an interesting way. Just a few days ago, the prediction was that it was going to hit the coast as a Category 4 hurricane, a very devastating strength for a hurricane. And yet now we see the speed has reduced to just over 100 miles an hour. It's a Category 2 hurricane right now and could even weaken slightly more before it hits land. And the issue is not that it was a bad forecast by the Hurricane Center. They do the best they can with the data they have. But one thing, James, I have to mention, someone asked me in a radio interview the other day, a couple days ago, they said, well, what is Florence going to do? And I kind of laughed because I said, it's not the idea. We don't know what Florence is going to do. All we can do is predict based on the best models, based on the data we have, what we think it's going to do, and warn an appropriate area. And the problem with these man-made climate change models and things like that is they're telling us this is what's going to happen. And anybody who knows the quality of climate model science today knows that that is an educated guess at what might happen. And it can be indeed very different, just like with Florence. Getting hit by a Category 4 hurricane is very different than getting hit by a 1 or a 2. There's still going to be, sadly, a lot of damage, a lot of devastation, but not as bad as it could have been. So thank you for letting me share that.
Well, thank you, Stan. And I noticed that you say that the hurricane's wind speeds have declined. It is no longer a Category 4 hurricane. It's now a Category 2 hurricane. In the media this week, I know I've seen, and I imagine our viewers have seen as well, the assertion that global warming makes the seas warmer, and therefore it makes hurricanes stronger, more frequent. And the implication seemed to lead viewers to believe that there is a simple equation. Warmer seas equals stronger hurricanes. So has sea temperature off the coast of the Carolinas declined drastically in the past 24 hours, or are there other factors involved? And if so, what are they?
Well, actually, when a hurricane sits over a particular area, the sea does cool some because of the effects of the hurricane. But as far as where it is going and the sea surface temperatures on where it's approaching to, no, it has not declined. In fact, I had a friend of mine Facebook me the other day and said, Stan, why is it weakening? The vertical shear is low, the sea temperature is warm, and why is it declining? I said, well, you have interaction with land. You have all sorts of other factors that enter in there. And we've had certain years where the sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic have been exceptionally warm, and yet we have very little activity because the atmospheric conditions are not ripe for it. And in fact, even if you accept the man-made global warming climate models and those results that they're saying, even if the oceans are warming on the average a couple degrees, the fact is that changes in the atmospheric circulations would make you need a higher temperature to produce the same kind of hurricane. So you can't just look at the sea temperature. I have to tell you, there was an article that was submitted to a journal a year or two ago, and they took Hurricane Sandy, and they said, what would Hurricane Sandy look like in the double CO2 world with warmer SSTs? And I was given that article to look at, and it was kind of comical because all they did was change the sea surface temperature. So if you don't change anything else and you just make the sea surface temperature warmer, you're going to get a stronger hurricane. And we wrote back to the person and said, that's not the atmosphere that they expect 20, 50 years from now. So if you change everything, you'll find out the storm will be about the same. So you can pick and choose, and everybody thinks warmer SSTs, warmer sea surface temperatures, for laymen, stronger hurricanes, more rainfall, and that is not really the case. And I'll just say in general, we have not seen anything that indicates that we're in an unprecedented time of more hurricanes or stronger hurricanes if you understand how to read the historical record. Because we can look back and say, oh, well, there's more recorded right now. Well, that's because we didn't have satellite, we didn't have the recon, we didn't have all sorts of other things to observe them out there. So if you take those things into account, we're not seeing anything unusual. Sadly, hurricanes are devastating, no matter where they hit. We have Cat 4, we can have a Cat 1, like Mitch hit Nicaragua, Honduras as a Category 1 hurricane in 1998. 10,000 people died. So someone else wants to say something here. Go ahead.
You mentioned two things that stand out to me. One is you mentioned the wind shear and how that affects hurricanes. And two, you talked about the hurricane records, what we see for the number and strengths of hurricanes. So now, for the whole panel, feel free to chime in with your own answer. But I'm curious as to, number one, for the global warming activists, they rely so much on and champion so much studies. What do the studies show? What do the indications show regarding how wind shear will be affected by global warming? Because I've seen a few and they jump right out at me. And second, if somebody would like to touch about the record of hurricanes and strong hurricanes in the United States and globally, and what trends we may or may not be seeing during recent decades as the world modestly warms.
James, let me jump in for a second because Stan described the problem with virtually all the predictions of global warming, climate change alarmists. And it is that they take only the data that works to prove the point they're trying to make. It's called selective data. And it goes against all science. In science, we have to look at all the data and make our conclusions based on it. What Stan just described, they just took a warm ocean and just left everything else out, and they put it into an equation and they get a stronger storm. It does not work that way. The great Willie Soon at Harvard said that on climate models, if they actually used all the variables, it would take the largest computer on the planet 40 years to come up with an answer if they had all the variables. So the opposition, the alarmists, just use whatever data works for them, and it's called cherry picking, and they do it very well. It's absurd, but the public, not scientifically trained, do not understand it, as Stan so well explained it just now.
And that's why we have this panel here. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it would be important for people who are not scientists to understand what we mean by wind shear. This is one of the 6 parameters that the hurricane guru, Dr. Bill Gray, identified as generating hurricanes. And wind shear generally is the changes in wind speed and direction that occur between layers in the atmosphere. And I think that's really important for people to understand, because if there's very little wind shear, it allows the hurricane to build up from sea level to very high altitudes without having its top cut off. And according to an expert I was just speaking to, the wind shear was low in the Gulf this year, and that was a major cause of less hurricanes this year. And the wind shear was high. That's right. The wind shear was high because it cuts the top off. It was last year that the wind shear was low and allowed hurricanes to really, really build up. So I think it's important to understand that is one of the major factors, and that is, entirely natural, determined by a host of meteorological factors that are not under our control.
So studies that I have seen, peer-reviewed studies, indicate that with global warming, that we are likely to see more wind shear, which would inhibit hurricane formation.
Yeah, cut off the top.
To a certain degree, and perhaps to an even greater degree than the modest warming of ocean temperatures, would inhibit hurricane formation and strengthening. Have I read that wrong? Is there anything that
Now wait, James, I have to ask you, are you talking about natural global warming and climate change? Or are you talking about anthropogenic man-made global warming and climate change? I like putting that in there because as someone who has specialized in climate science much of my career, I definitely believe in climate change. The climate is always changing. That's so important. And I'm sorry, I'm diverging a second. I heard one of the speakers say we must stop climate change. You can't stop the climate from changing. You can deal with certain anthropogenic contributions, man-made, however small they are, but there's massive, well-documented natural changes in the climate that have been going on for as long as we can do recorded history. So let's get that clear. We're talking about anthropogenic contributions, and some of the best studies have actually shown that there's several different signals going on. You can't just blanketly say, hey, this is changing, this is doing this, and that some of those signals suggest that based on what the models are saying about anthropogenic climate change, if you accept those model results, which not all of us do, feel that they're the truth, the gospel truth, is that it would actually increase the official name, by the way, is the vertical shear of the horizontal wind. So it's the change for what we use for hurricanes is the difference between the winds in the lower layers of the atmosphere and the upper layers of the atmosphere. And that trumps almost everything. You can have boiling sea surface temperatures. If that vertical shear is high enough, it's going to rip the storms apart. And so it shows that indeed that might increase in a lot of areas. And in fact, some of the best models right now are really saying that we would possibly, it suggests, it's not predicting accurate, it's suggesting that we could see fewer numbers of hurricanes, as much as 25% fewer, and even fewer of the major hurricanes, but maybe the strongest ones would be a little bit stronger of the amount that we can hardly measure today. So we're talking about an impact that's not going to necessarily increase it. Let me say the main people that come along and say we're seeing worse hurricanes, it's getting worse, are comparing it, like I said, to a faulty interpretation of the historical database, or a very narrow, like in the Atlantic, from the early 70s, and I wrote a paper on this on Science, early 70s to about 1994, it's what we call a low activity era. And then before that, it was a high activity era. So what do? They start their study in the low activity era, go to the high activity era and say, look at this increase, and they forget it's a cycle. That's like looking at the temperatures in your Chicago from January to July and saying we're going to all be melting by December. And anybody knows it's a cycle, it's going to go down again. So I hope I've answered a little bit of your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to take a little different approach to answering the question. I see myself as a climate and weather historian, like I'm aware of the 1821 hurricane that struck Cape May, New Jersey, 1790, the Great Caribbean Hurricane. And I just have almost an unnatural interest in that. And in the Carolinas, the storm of record is Hazel in 1954, and it sure looks like Florence is going to be nowhere near a Hazel quality storm. Well, it was 1954. What caused that? And my approach to the question of whether anthropogenic global warming is happening or there's what the effect is going to be is that pre-industrial levels were 280 parts per million carbon dioxide. Now it's about 410. The feared threshold is a doubling from 280 to 560. So we're about halfway there. So half of the feared and dreaded effects ought to be already happening. So look at recent years and see what actually is happening. And in hurricanes, there is no such trend.
Can I
Yes.
just to summarize some of this business on wind
Take
shear?
Mike.
Yeah, the wind shear issue I think is very important because activists and even some scientists are saying that global warming made the Gulf of Mexico warmer last year and the air more humid and therefore more hurricanes. But if I understand you rightly, Stanley, what we're really saying is that last year when the hurricane activity was high, the main cause was low wind shear. That's the case? It was not the change in temperature?
It's a combination of those things. You can't ever put it on just one particular factor. You have to have the warmer oceans, and you have to have the lower wind shear, and other things. It's the waves, it's the African easterly jet. There's all sorts of different kind of things.
But if you have a warmer ocean and you have high wind shear, you're not going to get the hurricanes. Is that right?
Normally you will not. Normally you will not.
So let's test the theory with the observations and the data. During the past few decades, as we're told, we've had this unprecedented warming. Have we seen, very direct question, have we seen an increase in the number of hurricanes? Have we seen an increase in the total hurricane energy around the globe?
Well, first of all, before I forget, one of the earliest speakers mentioned the impact on the Lesser Antilles. Unprecedented Category 5 hurricane. It actually devastated two of the islands there. And she said, we're seeing more of this and more of this. Well, perhaps she forgot the great 1780 hurricane, which was the deadliest Atlantic hurricane on record, killing over 20,000 people in the Lesser Antilles. So we've seen this kind of stuff before and even worse in the past. But, and now you got to bring me back to your question. I'm so sorry.
So, and I'll have you speak right into the microphone with your answer, if
Okay.
you will, and others may answer as well. But very direct question. We're told that we are seeing unprecedented
remember.
frequency
Okay.
and strength of hurricanes as a result of global warming. We have observations, we have data, we can compare the data. Is that assertion true?
Well, let me first of all do it one particular basin and then globally, because there's different basins. There's different hurricane basins. They're all very, very unique in how they deal with different climate fluctuations. Climate fluctuations, meaning the climate's always fluctuating, not necessarily man-made. In the Atlantic, if you go look at the Atlantic, compared to the activity in the 70s and 80s, the overall energy has doubled. The number of major hurricanes up by a factor of 2.5. The number of Caribbean hurricanes up by a factor of 5. The number of October major hurricanes up by a factor of 10, meaning an average of 1 every 10 years to 1 every year. Oh, but by the way, that was similar to the activity we saw back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. All right, so yes, it's increased in the last few decades. It has increased. However, we've seen that kind of increase in the past. Globally, someone did an excellent study, And people have to understand the observational network is constantly changing. So before the 40s, we didn't have recon. We just had ship data, land data. That's all we had. Then we finally had aircraft reconnaissance data, although the early measurements were very archaic in how they would decide on the speed of a storm. Literally, just for interest, someone would sit in the underbelly of the storm and look at the waves and estimate the wind speeds from looking at the waves. And sometimes their commanding officer would say, there's no way the storm could be that strong, and they knock it down. So now we have instruments that drop right into the storms and scatter wave, microwave, I mean, everything that we're measuring from the planes now. But we have the planes, and in the 60s, we got satellite data. So you could pick up these storms way out there at sea that no one would have even known existed before. But even the satellite observations are changing constantly. And sorry to give a complicated answer because a lot of this stuff is not hand-waving. I'm a scientist and you have to be very specific with this. So the satellite, even the new satellites we just put up there are much better than the satellites from a few years ago. So what happens is he took and looked at the satellite observations for the past, I think it was about 40 years or so, about 35-year period, and degraded the recent satellites to make it kind of uniform how they measured it. Guess what? Globally, there was no trend in the cyclone energy globally, just nothing. And that's because he took a very careful analysis of it, not, hey, we got stronger storms and someone qualitatively says it's worse. So I hope that helps answer the question.
So let's, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Tom in a minute, but let me avail ourselves of your expertise. Stan, one more time for a question. I've seen in the news during the past couple
After all,
days.
it's the peak of the hurricane season.
It is the peak of the hurricane season. That's what's been in the news, and that's what people are concerned about for good reason today. It's been in the news. I've seen the assertions from the global warming activists that as a result of global warming, the steering currents, the wind patterns, have slowed down, making it more likely, and therefore global warming's fault, that we would have
man-made global warming.
There we go.
Yeah, okay, just making
anthropogenic
sure.
global warming's fault. For example, off the Texas coast last year, and the assertion that the prediction that for Florence, Hurricane Florence, might slow down and be relatively stationary for a short period here. Is global warming causing a decline in these wind speeds of the steering currents such that it makes these hurricanes more deadly by sitting on a single area without moving and then drenching them with torrential rains?
Like Houston last year.
Exactly.
Right. Well, let me tell you this, James, and I'm going to really shout this really loud, but I'm going to turn my volume down. And that is, we've seen this stuff before. It doesn't shock us when a storm sits there, meanders, stalls. We've seen this many, many, many times. The fact of maybe they're thinking, well, 5% slower wind steering currents or something. I mean, where they're getting this stuff from, I don't know all the studies, but I'm sure it's either from a combination of observations or they ran a model. So they ran a model, and the model said this, and therefore that's the gospel truth. Well, I wish all the models on Hurricane Florence would have known exactly what it was going to do about 4 or 5 days ago, and they're talking about decades. The issue is we've seen slow storms before. Even the amount, they say, oh, the sea surface temperatures are warmer, so therefore we're going to get more rainfall. We've seen heavy rain events before, and my historian over here could probably remember all of them, horrible rain events. That a storm after it hit
Hurricane
land.
Easy in Florida, 1950.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You have these storms sit there and produce tremendous flooding, especially over where I'm really concerned right now are the hilly regions of the Carolinas and the Appalachians. This thing could come over there as a depression and kill a lot of people due to the flash flooding. So, yeah, we're not surprised by any stalling. This happens all the time. And the real problem is if something bad happens, there's a group of people that have to blame it on man-made global warming or anthropogenic global warming, we'll call it AGW for short, and they have to blame it on that. So they find, well, maybe it did this, maybe it did this, and it warmed this. And it's like they refuse to just look at the simple, common historical fact of what we're dealing with.
And global warming, well, before we had human-caused global warming, we had hurricanes, we had tornadoes, we had droughts, we had floods. There's nothing about global warming, human-caused global warming theory that would indicate that it should stop hurricanes from happening. And yet, as you point out, every time there's a hurricane, the blame is on global warming. If you pass the microphone down to Tom, I know he's been itching to weigh in here. So go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, one of the ways we know that global warming is not making them worse is by looking at the storm surge from hurricanes. I mean, this is when the water level suddenly rises and causes enormous troubles. And, you know, for example, Hurricane Sandy had a storm surge of 4 meters. And the reason it was a real problem is because the walls that were holding it back were only 1.5 meters. But 4 meters is not large in comparison with historical records. For example, the record is the Baker Gunj, if that's the way you pronounce it, cyclone in Bangladesh in 1876. It was 13.6 meters. 13.6. Remember, I said Sandy was 4. Okay, there are some websites, and in fact, the Australian government say that the record was set in 1899 at about 15 meters. Okay,
That's how many years of global warming ago?
Yeah, that was the end of a cooling period. But here's some other interesting things. The maximum number of storm deaths by a tropical cyclone, and of course hurricanes are the North Atlantic version of tropical cyclones, was in Bangladesh fairly recently. 1970, it was 300,000 people died, okay?
And yet still 50 years of global warming ago.
Yeah, so I mean, the obvious thing to be doing is to be building storm shelters. And this is something that India does very well. They have storm shelters built, multi-story storm shelters, every kilometer along the coast. So you never, this is the coast of the Bay of Bengal where most of the tropical cyclones are coming in. So they never have to walk more than half a kilometer to engage in vertical evacuation to just go up. And that's something that other countries should really copy. They've done a good job there.
I'm glad you mentioned Sandy, because I recall when Sandy came ashore, and I was watching, I like to watch the full variety of cable news channels because I want to make sure I'm getting all perspectives and can weigh them all. At this time, I happened to have Fox News on, and I recall Shepard Smith observing the hurricane and saying something along the lines of, folks, you can say what you want, but this didn't used to occur. And I looked at the data, and Stan, you may be well familiar with this because this is what you do. And I looked at the data, and what I found is that I looked at National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data on major hurricanes, Category 3 or stronger, hitting the U.S. Northeast. So those are ones we're told do the most damage, the ones we should be concerned about. Keep in mind, Sandy was barely Category 1 strength when it came ashore. It technically wasn't defined as a hurricane then, but it had minimal hurricane strength, Hurricane 1 winds. And what I noticed looking at the data, this is government data, NOAA data, was that in the first half of the 20th century, hurricanes of a Category 3 or stronger level there came ashore relatively frequently. Almost every decade you would have one. Sometimes you would have multiple Cat 3 or stronger hurricanes striking the U.S. Northeast coast in that time. And the reason perhaps why for Shepard Smith and others, where it seems that this didn't used to happen, is because since the 1950s, as our Earth has warmed, for whatever reason, we don't see, at least we haven't seen those types of hurricanes. We have one that I recall, Hurricane Gloria in 1986 was the only one that came ashore in the Northeast during the past, I believe it was 50 years. And I know Hurricane Gloria because I was in college in Hanover, New Hampshire at the time, and the eye of the storm actually came up the Connecticut River Valley over Hanover, New Hampshire.
And I was in a plane flying it.
And you were flying it. But the point is, anecdotes and observations, and this is what we're seeing at the Global Climate Action Summit right now, where you have a political leader or some activist from some nation talk about a drought, blame it on global warming, make the assumption that anything that happens that can go wrong in this climate must be caused by global warming, without looking at long-term data, without understanding that these are events that have occurred in the past. And in the case of Sandy illustrating hurricane strikes in the U.S. Northeast, these used to occur much more frequently and much more severely. Now, has our warming planet, from whatever cause, been a factor in us having much fewer of these events? I don't know, but you certainly can't make the argument based on scientific data that global warming is causing more frequent and severe U.S. Northeast hurricane strikes like Sandy, which is what Shepard Smith implied to all the viewers on Fox News. And I don't mean to pick on Shepard Smith. He's not alone. That was the mantra coming out at the time. Before we move on to another topic, because there's so much to cover.
Comments about
Yes.
Sandy. I believe Sandy did have the highest storm surge level ever recorded in Manhattan. However, it did not have the highest storm surge itself because Sandy occurred at high tide. The 1821 hurricane actually had a greater storm surge by several feet, but it occurred fortunately at low tide. And again, this was in 1821. So why was Hurricane Sandy so devastating and few of us have heard of the 1821 hurricane? Well, who lived in Sandy Hook, New Jersey in 1821 as compared to now?
No one.
You know, or it did a bullseye right over Cape May, New Jersey. How many people lived in Cape May and Wildwood, New Jersey in 1821? A few intrepid fishermen who probably had the sense to get out of there well in advance.
So
Let me just chime in. It's very important because as a historian, you have to understand what's happened in the past to properly interpret the present. And I go back to the issue that people who are prone to want to blame everything on anthropogenic global warming or climate change don't dig to find out the real causes. Some people would call people like myself or others deniers. And I take great offense with that, being Jewish, because they're pointing at Holocaust deniers who, of course, stupidly ignoring historical data. Well, a denier is someone who looks, who sees the data, who sees what's there, and closes their eyes and doesn't want to see it. I say the people on the other side who are blaming all this stuff on man-made causes are the real deniers because they're not looking at the full data. By the way, they mentioned the Bay of Bengal cyclones. I have a chart, and people can, by the way, look at talks by myself and other people on the panel here, looking at the heartland.org page, and simply go at the bottom where it says climate conferences, and you can see numerous talks by lots of speakers, and they're welcome to look at some of my talks where I show charts with this. But the Bay of Bengal cyclones, the 1971, which caused over 500,000 deaths. Can we comprehend that? 500,000 deaths. And yet since then, there's hardly been a year over 100,000. So global warming, if what they're saying is right, that we're really facing this horrible man-made global warming, it's reduced the number of deaths. But let me tell you the real cause of the deaths. Dr. Neil Frank, good friend of mine who used to be director of the National Hurricane Center and is now in Houston, Texas, he told me what happened, that he went over there after one of these events, and he wanted to know why did they have so many deaths. And he really searched into the preparedness, everything that happened, and he found out that everybody just did their job. In other words, one person did the forecast, passed to the next person. Nobody really sounded the alarm of how serious this was going to be and took the action that was necessary. Well, that's not man-made global warming. Okay, that's human, that's man-made disaster, and even in Katrina. Everybody screamed. I mean, front page on Time magazine, are we making hurricanes worse? And it was Hurricane Katrina. Why did so many people die in Katrina? Two things. One word is levees. The fact that the levees were there, they didn't even have the strongest part of the storm, and it just flooded the city. And the other reason was the negligence of the government officials and the people to properly evacuate in front of a disaster. So neither of those has to do with man-made global warming.
So one final question regarding hurricanes. Dr. Gannon, tying in the science with the public messaging, with the politicization of this, Stan mentioned the New York Times headline, and just the other day, the Washington Post posted a House editorial in which they said that President Donald Trump is, quote, complicit in Hurricane Florence. And I'll note that since that editorial was published, Hurricane Florence has diminished from a Category 4 hurricane to a Category 2 hurricane. And I say that anecdotally and to make a point, but really my question is this. What do you see in the media, among the activists at the Global Climate Action Summit, in terms of taking a science issue and perverting the science, at least in my view, if I'm wrong, tell me, but how they apply it for further ulterior motives and ends? I mean, does the science match up with the agenda and vice versa?
Well, I think the simple answer there is that the science doesn't line up with this fabulous marketing program. I mean, you can step back and look at the emphasis on charts, on presenting their case, and a lot of sound bites, a lot of, it's worse than we thought. It's, we couldn't have predicted this. And I think the point is, and I think my tie, which sort of symbolizes that, is that if what we're seeing this morning, which is showing up in various media outlets every day, is certainly, and they're very consistent, and it's a very strong marketing program to try to develop association of terms. Now, I think even yesterday, Trump was blamed as a racist for complicit in the Florence hurricane. So the idea of association, guilty by association, without science is it becomes an idea that really isn't really even pseudoscience. It's marketing for a cause. It's marketing for an event. And I think what's really interesting is that, with all the things that we heard this morning about all the alliances being formed and how cities can become much more efficient and everyone can contribute and we all need to work together, I think we all need to work together to understand the basic threat that we face. Now, this morning it was a threat of too many human emissions. And thank you, Governor Brown, for blaming the citizens of California for the forest fires that were so badly managed. But we'll get to that later, hopefully. I think that, as you look at marketing, you say, well, we're going to make this climate, we're going to make the globe a better place to live. And it's going to be a safe place. It's going to be wonderful. All this clean energy is going to come on seamlessly. And I only can ask, what about the people that are left behind? What about my friends in Africa? What about all the people that are below the poverty level? Will they ever have a chance if fossil fuels are indeed killed within the next few decades? What is not stated, but highly implicit and even stated elsewhere, is that the whole idea in a carbon tax is to kill fossil fuels. The whole idea in all these policies is to basically kill fossil fuels, not replace it with nuclear, not do anything in terms of really sound market-driven energy, but to bring on something that really is going to devastate parts of the world. We never hear about that. So the marketing plan is promoting a cause that could cause significant harm in parts of the world.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gannon. Let's move on to another topic. One of the few instances in which something scientific was somewhat mentioned at the Global Climate Action Summit, and I'm going to repeat that because no science was presented, and no science ever is. They always say they don't want to discuss the science. They're not here to debate the science. Well, there's a reason for that, because the science contradicts what they assert. But one of the assertions was that temperatures now are the warmest they've been since the last ice age. The gentleman from Stockholm, I believe the Stockholm Sustainability Center or something like that, made that assertion.
Johan Rock.
So let me ask the question, and I guess I'll start this with Dr. Keene, but anybody else, please feel free to weigh in. Are temperatures today, and it's important to have the right context, are today's temperatures warmer than they've been since the last ice age? And when was that last ice age?
Well, the last ice age peaked about 18,000 years ago. And about 12,000 years ago, the big melt began. And about 5,000 years ago, the big melt finished. But there's still some residual ice around places like Greenland and Antarctica. So by some definitions, we are still in an ice age. Okay, so our current temperatures, and by current, maybe talking the past 20, 30 years, are they the warmest since the last ice age? No way. We talk about climate deniers. I think the truest climate deniers are the ones who think climate history began in 1970 or 1960. And you'll see a lot of graphs showing average temperatures in Paducah, Kentucky starting in 1960. And you might see a warming trend going up. Or picking some other place, Johannesburg, you pick a spot. If you start in 1970, odds are you will see warming. Not universally, but you'll probably see more stations warming than cooling. But weather data goes back a couple hundred years. The thermometer was invented in the 1700s. And there were widespread in certain countries, US and Europe and Japan, places have a pretty good climate record. And the hottest years on record, many of these places remains in the 1930s. Well, what were the 1930s noted for? Anybody in the U.S. who was alive at that time will know it for the Dust Bowl. And not only was it hot, it was extreme. I mean, I can throw anecdotal numbers, to a closing time here. But I'll mention it was 120 degrees in North Dakota. It was also 60 below in North Dakota that winter. Both were the highest and coldest ever recorded in North Dakota. So if we want to talk about climate weirding instead of global warming, which is sort of the tendency because really the warming is becoming less and less apparent as time goes on. So we talk about global weirding or more extremes. You go back to the 1930s and you can't shake a stick at what happened. In terms of hurricanes, the greatest hurricane in New England, a Category 3, struck Long Island, went up the Connecticut River Valley, did not happen before that we know of, and hasn't happened since.
So let's go back a little further and make sure we have the proper context about warmer temperatures. The Little Ice Age, which occurred from approximately 1300 to 1850 AD, and scientists can differ over 50 years, plus or minus on those. But what were temperatures like during the medieval warm period before the Little Ice Age compared to today? And even before then, you mentioned that the last ice age glaciation ended approximately, or at least its stages started to end approximately 12,000 years ago. What were temperatures like then as human civilization first developed with much less adaptive technologies than we have today?
Okay, let's go in Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine and start advancing backwards in time. Okay, Little Ice Age would have been in the 1600s mostly. By some definitions, it continued in the 1800s. In the 17 and 1800s, we had documented temperature measurements. In the 1600s, we did not. So it's based on proxy data like extent of glaciers, tree rings, and anecdotes. And of course, some of the famous anecdotes are people ice skating on the Thames River in London, which I don't think they're able to do now. So it was cooler back then. Definitely
Valley
cooler.
Forge, you got to mention Valley
Okay,
Forge.
Valley Forge was 1776.
So the Little Ice
okay.
Age was cold. We know that. But
Yeah,
what about
okay, that
before
was
the
a
Little
cold
Ice
period.
Age? Compare
Okay,
temperatures to today.
Okay, let's way back before that to 1,000 years ago. And my favorite anecdote was that the Vikings were colonizing Greenland then. Not only colonizing, thriving, because they were raising barley and brewing their own beer. And that is a mark of civilization, high civilization, to be able to grow and brew your own beer. They actually
In more ways than one.
There are breweries in Greenland now, but they have to import the barley from Denmark because you cannot grow barley in Denmark now. In Greenland. You cannot grow barley, and you were not able to do it since about 1200, and that's when the colonies faded.
So
And
clearly
they
temperatures
actually
were
went
warmer
extinct because probably because they couldn't brew beer.
So clearly temperatures were warmer then.
Warmer around 1000 AD, and then there's evidence of a cooler period around 500 AD. That's called the Attila cool period. And then around the year 0, there was a warm period. And so you have, I'm not going to call them cycles because that implies a lockstep every 1,000 years, but you have these sort of time scales of maybe 1,000, 2,000 years apart. There was a maximum about 2000 BC or about 1500 called the Minoan maximum, when the Minoans were prospering before the eruption of Santorini wiped them out. Okay, go back even farther. Oh, let me back up again, 1008. There's actually more evidence of 1000 AD, 1,000 years ago, being much warmer than it is now. Somehow people seem to dread the loss of Arctic sea ice. I frankly don't see that as particularly a bad thing or a good thing. I mean,
it happened.
I don't
it's
think
happened historically.
and it's happened in the past with no ill effects. 1000 AD, there's evidence that there was not summer ice at the North Pole, and regularly that the North Pole was open in midsummer. And the evidence is at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean at the North Pole, there is old algae that sank to the bottom. You carbon date it, it's 1,000 years old. Well, to have algae growing in seawater, you need the sun hitting the water directly. If there's ice, it does not hit the water, so there's no algae. So you had this period 1000 AD when the Arctic ice was open. Okay, go back even farther.
I think that's good enough for the purpose of this point.
No,
The point
actually,
is-
this other one I think
All right,
is
give me
even
one
more
more.
remarkable.
We have
Okay,
so many topics to touch that the Global Climate Action Summit
The peak
won't.
warming after the Ice Age, since they like to claim it's the warmest since it's been since the Ice Age, no, it was about 8,000 BC, or 8,000 years ago, 6,000 BC, thing called the Holocene optimum. The reason for it is actually predictable. It has to do with the tilt of the Earth's axis. And the North Pole was tilted during the sun during the summer. Geometrically, you can calculate it quite accurately using the orbit of the Earth, that the polar regions receive more sunlight back then. And the evidence is, I've spent quite a few summers up in a place called the Juneau Icefield, and the icefield is 100 miles long, and a mile deep. And it's sure fun skiing on a mile of ice. It's quite an experience. Well, the evidence is 8,000 years ago, that ice was not there. That ice field did not exist. How do you know? There's tree stumps coming out the bottom of the glacier that are 8,000 years old. Those trees were growing where now it's a mile-deep glacier.
So the science is pretty clear.
So
that
there's
it's been
tons
warmer.
of evidence that...
So the assertion made at the Global Climate Action Summit, I'm sure that the New York Times and the Washington Post tomorrow morning will correct that assertion, that this is not the warmest that we've ever had since the last ice age. But let me ask you,
I
Dr.
think we'd have to count
Gannon.
on CNN for that.
Yeah.
James, can I do?
Well, let me get Dr. Gannon in first, and then
Okay.
go ahead, Tom. So tell me, what is the proper context? I mean, what is the left missing here, or the climate activists? What are they missing here?
Well, I think the point that we saw this morning, as I mentioned earlier about the marketing, the emphasis on marketing is by its nature not necessarily bad, but marketing towards a conclusion devoid of data and devoid of science is bad. And I think the various attempts, most of you will be well aware of the fact of the attempts to get rid of the medieval warming period, the hockey stick, etc., even despite the fact that the paintings that occurred in that time period showed clearly that, the middle warming period was actually warmer than it or as warm or warmer than it is today. So I think that really, as we look at the marketing side of things versus the reality side of things, as the gap gets bigger, this is the real challenge for people in the greater community. I think the people that were there in the summit today and in the audience today, are clearly very convinced of the marketing message. And none of them, I think, at the conference, and I would be surprised if there was any single person that could justify the future predictions coming from the climate models. And we could talk extensively about the climate models.
We will shortly.
Yeah, we will shortly. So I think that, this is really an important point to reflect on. I went to a talk at Stanford, very brief story. And Stephen Schneider was giving a talk a couple of decades ago while he was still alive. He became a very strong global warming advocate, an AGW advocate. But back in the 50s and 60s, he was selling the consensus of global cooling. And he said at the end of his talk, I think this is really something that I reflected on before coming here. He said at the very end of the talk, and he was outside at Stanford, so he knew he had a very friendly audience. He basically made the statement, well, we all know that, basic majority rule works in courts, but really what I'm interested in is social engineering. And I think that really struck me at the time, and I've learned nothing since then to suggest otherwise. If you're out for social engineering, are you really out for social good? And I think we're seeing now reasons to be concerned.
So it's not that they're missing anything, it's that they have a different agenda. Tom, go ahead.
Dr. Tim Ball, an historical climatologist, sent me one sentence, which I think is beautiful to end this particular topic if you want to go on to others. He said, you can mention that it was warmer than today for at least 95% of the last 10,000 years. That's what he said.
James?
Yes.
I hope people watching this get the idea that there's a lot of data on the other side, that we're all fighting to get in pieces of data because there's so much to say. And I just want to read something that they should read this at the Climate Summit. I think they should really read this today to describe what's going on. And this is from a reliable source, American Meteorological Society Monthly Weather Review publication, that the Arctic Ocean is warming up. Icebergs are growing scarcer, and in some places the seals are finding the water too hot, according to a report by the Commerce Department at Bergen, Norway. Reports from fishermen, sea hunters, explorers all over point to radical change in climate conditions. Why aren't they reading this? And hitherto unheard of temperatures in the Arctic zone. Exploration expeditions report scarcely any ice as far north as 81 degrees. Soundings show the Gulf Stream very warm. Masses of ice have been replaced by moraines of earth and stones, and it goes on and on. Within a few years, it's predicted that due to the ice melt, the sea will rise and make most coastal cities uninhabitable.
What year was that written?
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. This is 1922. This is November 1922, and this is real. This is not urban legend.
Yeah.
This has really happened. This was really reported. It was warm then, and then guess what happened after that? Of course, it cooled off, and so I just had to throw that. Monthly weather review.
Meteorological Society publication.
These were all facts. It was
Yeah.
extremely warm back then in the polar regions.
And
Well,
could I have one up
go ahead.
Tom for a second here? Okay. Tom mentioned 90%. Was 90% of the time since the Ice Age, the Earth was warmer than it is now. Actually, 90% of the time since creation, the Earth was warmer than it is now, because the geological evidence indicates that over all of geologic history, 4.65 billion years, somewhere between 5 and 10% of that time was there any substantial ice on Earth. And now there is. There's Greenland, Antarctica, and then summer ice all over the planet, well, lots of places. So you're talking 5 or 10% of the time was the planet cooler than it is now.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we're at one of the lowest levels of CO2 in Earth's history. Okay,
Yes,
that's really
very good
important.
point.
I mean, 440 million years ago, when we were in the depths of the coldest period in the last half billion years, we had 1,100% of today's CO2 levels, according to geologic proxies. So, yeah, CO2 is very low right now. They say 40% rise in the last century since 1880. Well, that's peanuts in natural terms.
Well, then
So-
we should be very glad.
Wasn't there a carboniferous?
The carbon dioxide in this room is now around 900. Now, either we should be happy about it or perhaps evacuate the room for fear that there's something bad about it. There's nothing bad about carbon dioxide. The more, the better.
So let's move on to another topic here, and as we watch the 600 or so people watching, I have to note this is rather amusing and encouraging, because according to the data on their YouTube page and on their website, the Global Climate Action Summit's averaging about 700 viewers worldwide right now. So perhaps people are understanding that science is important and propaganda isn't. But the Global Climate Action Summit, it's one of the events that are occurring this fall, trying to build momentum for the United Nations Conference of the Parties taking place in Poland in December. And I think it's really worth noting that if you go back to the first United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment report, the assertion was that the climate models showed that we would see 0.3 degrees Celsius of warming per decade for the next century. And back at the time, skeptics, including myself, the skeptics generally saw a warming occurring at a pace of about 1 degree Celsius for whatever reason, and said, well, that's where we're going to place our bets, because that's what the observations tell us. Since that time, so we had a 0.2 degree per Celsius difference. Alarmists 0.3 degrees, skeptics 0.1. Since that time, the United Nations now has reduced their projections to 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. In other words, they've already admitted that if there's a difference between us, at least half of it is their fault, them being in the bad. And yet, as Stan mentioned before, we're the ones called deniers. And even more importantly, the data show that temperatures have warmed since 1990, when that first assessment report was published. The temperatures have risen at about 0.13 degrees Celsius per decade. So what we see is a significant difference between what the models predicted and what's occurring in the real world. And what's occurring in the real world is much closer to what skeptics have been predicting all along. So let me start off with Dr. Keene, and please, others feel free to answer as well. What are these models getting wrong? After all, these are computer models. Computers don't make mistakes, right?
Actually, computers rarely make mistakes, but the people who program them have been noted for doing that. And well, allow me to give a little bit of a history of the whole concept of global warming, carbon dioxide. It was first thought up in the 1860s. Who was that, Arrhenius?
Arrhenius, yeah.
Arrhenius, Swede. And qualitatively, he didn't really come up with a number. The first real numbers came up in the 60s and 70s. Al Gore is on record as saying it's simple physics. Well, it's not simple physics. It requires radiative transfer and integral calculus, but it's not rocket science, true rocket science either. And you can calculate the warming effect of, say, 100 parts per million, which is one molecule in 100,000 added to the atmosphere, of that much carbon dioxide in the air above us. And if you do the basic calculations, how much infrared is absorbed, how much is re-radiated, and do the basic calculations, you will get, for a doubling of carbon dioxide, 0.6 degrees. Now, doubling of carbon dioxide, that's from, say, 300 to 600, and we're about 410 now. So, again, that's sort of the classic threshold that the global warming people like to refer to. So that theory would be 0.6 degrees. Well, there are models then, they say, well, that's not enough. We got to be able to predict more. So they come up with, quote, feedbacks. The biggest feedback, if it's warmer, it should theoretically evaporate more moisture from the oceans. You get more H2O in the atmosphere. Well, water vapor is a greenhouse gas itself, and that maybe would increase the warming by, say, another degree. Well, but what does water do when it's in the atmosphere? Well, it makes clouds and then falls out as rain or snow. So clouds, what do? They reflect sunlight. Overall, a cooling effect from clouds. So more water vapor, is it more warming because of the greenhouse effect of it, or more cooling because of the reflection? Nobody knows. But the bottom line is, though, if you start in 1979, which is actually the first year we have a really reliable, truly global temperature, it's the beginning of the satellite record. Before that, it's just weather stations scattered around the planet. Before 1958, there were none in Antarctica, so the planet was and remains poorly sampled by weather stations. But yeah, the satellite in the polar orbit, it goes around and measures the temperature everywhere, every square inch of the planet. Well, since 1979, the warming trend has been about 0.2 of a degree. The models predict it should be over 1 degree. Again, this is just the past 40 years. But the observed increase of 0.2 of a degree is somewhat deceptive, because during the first half of that period, we're talking since 1979, 1982 and 1991, there were 2 huge volcanoes that had measurable detectable effect cooling the planet. So we're starting from a planet that was cooled by volcanoes and then measuring the upward trend. You fill in, adjust out those volcanoes as best you can, you get about 0.1 of a degree of warming over 40 years due to other things, presumably carbon dioxide, but who knows what else. So it actually puts a real limit, and the real limit is more in line with these early simple calculations without the fancy feedbacks. And since 1970, we spent probably $100 billion and inordinate amount of computer money, consuming incredible amounts of coal-fired power and electricity to run these models, continuously generating all sorts of waste heat. And these computer models now are worse than the original model that you could do on a TI-57.
Well,
that's a hand calculator.
You raise an important point in that, although the carbon dioxide additions, according to physics, should, all other things being equal, perhaps raise temperatures a little bit, according to the climate models, the vast majority of warming that is predicted comes not from carbon dioxide. It comes from these speculative feedbacks, which are much more difficult to nail down. And the 2 that you mentioned, atmospheric water vapor and clouds, what we've seen is the observations show that while we are getting some increase in atmospheric humidity, it's not increasing as rapidly as the models predicted to come up with the much larger warming that they predicted. And the form of the humidity is taking more the form of rain clouds, as you mentioned, which are cooling, have cooling impacts, and far less frequently they're occurring in the form of cirrus clouds, which are a warming factor, which the climate models are programmed to assume will be more prevalent. And there you have the observations that defy the theory and explain why not only we're seeing less warming than predicted, but we know through observation now the scientific reasons. And that's the scientific method in action. It's the deniers who don't want to critically challenge theories. It's the deniers who don't want to put theories and speculation to the test and look at observations. It's scientists who do that, and it's fantastic that we have folks on this panel and elsewhere that are performing science.
Well, data is how you
the
verify.
audience needs to know something even simpler than that. The government, for the past 20 years, has been supporting over 100 of these climate models to the tune of about $6 billion a year. None of the models have been able to predict backwards when all the data was known and actually show what the temperature of the planet was, say, 10 years ago. The models have all been operating for over 10 years. None of them have been able to predict the temperature of the planet 10 years forward where we are now. They are all wrong. And so what the government does is average 100 wrong answers and puts reliance on it. It's actually a joke, but it's a huge business, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon.
Well, we can't even predict an El Nino 3 months in advance. They're still talking a 50-50 chance of an El Nino this winter. If there is one, it would be starting in October or November.
Yeah.
So we can't even predict the state of the atmosphere 8 weeks from now.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add one quick point, and that is, if the science was settled, there wouldn't be over 100 models. There would be one.
Yeah.
Well,
Let me mention that El Nino thing. I was in a sitting in on a panel discussion. Listen to the title of it: How do we communicate the uncertainty without changing the message? In other words, how do we admit we really don't know what's happening and yet still drive home this message? And at one point during the panel, they sat there and said, now that we can predict El Nino so well, we can trust these things. And I was in the back. I burst out laughing, kind of just spontaneously, because I was looking at the El Nino forecast for something we were working on, and there was so much ambiguity with it. And I said, "You have got to be kidding! There's no. It's not that the El Nino predictions are worthless. They're working on it. They're different models. But as far as totally reliably predicting the onset of El Nino 3-4 months in advance, we still have a long way to go." And that's a climate forecast. People often argue, well, you can't talk about hurricane forecast because that's a weather forecast. These are climate forecasts. Well, El Nino is a climate forecast.
Dr.
Well,
Gannon.
weather forecasters. Oh, okay.
Dr. Gannon.
Hang on, I'll give you a shot at it. I think you can see a lot of enthusiasm on this topic. And I'm reminded often on this topic of my good friend Willie Soon's comment. We all have heard the term GIGO, usually referring to garbage in, garbage out. But in this case, what we're seeing, and I think this panel is underscoring that, you have garbage in, gospel out. So you really have a marketing message that's tuned. And I think that we have to underscore this in all of our communications. The basic idea, if the climate models do not work, and the feedback that we're talking about here is anywhere from 3 to 8x. Now, you could ask the question, nobody seems to, why is not the feedback applied to water vapor on its own? Why isn't water vapor capable of having its own feedback? So there's a basic flaw in the physics here. But I can tell you that, having gotten a Ph.D. in computer modeling in semiconductors, much simpler problem, is that the basic grid size, et cetera, all the things that we've talked about here could go on extensively. And I think there really needs to be an overall view of these climate models in a comprehensive paper or presentation. But, the idea that it doesn't predict rain, it doesn't predict ocean currents, it can't certainly predict hurricanes, even the path the next day. So you really basically look at these things, and, it's very clear that the computer models, even though they're tuned regularly, and we never know really how often they are tuned. And tuning means if you get a result, you change some of the input parameters, so you change the result to reflect reality. And the tuning apparently was done in the 90s and immediately went in the wrong direction, so more aerosols were added to bring the thing back down. I think unless you can convince yourself, and I'm speaking to the greater audience here, unless you can convince yourself as a citizen of this country and of the world that the computer models are exactly dead nuts on. All the things you heard at the summit this morning are completely self-serving, marketing, tribal chants, and the like. And we can go on from there.
Outstanding.
And I'm glad that you mentioned the self-serving aspects of the summit, because it's rather amusing if you're one of the 700 people globally that are watching this summit, how many of the speakers appear to have been selected for some reason other than climate knowledge or any type of scientific expertise. There seem to be a lot of wealth management companies, a lot of large corporations that are using this as a commercial and patting themselves on the back. I'm curious as to whether there'll be transparency in terms of how much money has been committed to fund this conference and or to fund other environmental activist causes, perhaps in exchange for their appearance at the Climate Action Summit. Although for 700 viewers, I'm not sure if it's money well spent. Tom?
Yeah, I think it's really important for people watching to understand that when you knock the legs out from under the climate models, when you show that they are not functioning, then the reason for the climate scare largely goes away, because what's happening in the world now is not outside of natural variability. Even NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and no one would accuse them of being climate change deniers, they say that since 1880, the CO2 has gone up 40%, and there's only been slightly over 1 degree Celsius rise. Oh, but we've got extreme weather is increasing. Well, NASA, not NASA, but the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration have a database of the extreme weather records for states. There was only one record set this year. It's kind of a funny one. It might actually have killed some people. It was a 5-inch plus hailstone in Alabama, okay? But if you're looking at when were the maximum temperature records set for states, if you were to believe Al Gore, you would think it would all be recent. Well, in fact, in the 21st century, there's only been 2 states that set maximum temperature records. That was in 2012 was South Carolina, and in 2006, South Dakota tied their maximum temperature record that was from 1936. But if you actually go back to the 1930s, here's what happened. In 1936, 15 states set their maximum temperature record, okay? In 1934, 4 states did. In 1930, 5 states did. You're contrasting that with 2 states in the whole of the 20th century setting maximum temperature records. And that's probably the best database of its kind in the world.
And
That's half of the
rhetorically,
states.
yeah, and rhetorically, I'll ask again: how many years of global warming ago was that? But let's move on to another topic.
James, let me just throw
Go
in,
ahead.
by the way, people might not be aware, we have, I think, hundreds of comments online from people coming in, and I'm sorry we aren't able to get to all the questions, just everything's happening so rapid fire, but thank you for all the comments and people.
Well, thank you, Stan. And for those that are, we are going to be back here again tomorrow. We are timing these science rebuttals to the Global Climate Action Summit to take advantage of downtime at their event, where we thought that all of their many viewers might want to see a different perspective. Turns out there aren't so many there after all, which is great. But nevertheless, tomorrow we will be live streaming at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. And when we do so, keep sending in questions, and we will respond. We will answer many of those questions directly, and we'll continue taking them. And we greatly appreciate everyone who is here watching. And that's whether you agree with the skeptic position that we've presented based on the science as we see it, whether you're on the other side or whether you don't know. Because ultimately, everyone should be challenging not just other people's views, but even more importantly, your own views. And that's how you're going to have an open-minded view of the science. And when people are debating and discussing the science with integrity, with sincerity, and based on information, ultimately iron sharpens iron, and that's how we get to understand what the scientific truths are. So we greatly appreciate you watching. Make sure you tune in tomorrow as well. But we still have some time here today. One thing I want to point out, I mentioned some of the self-serving comments and participations of people at the Global Climate Action Summit. One that struck me was Starbucks CEO Kevin Johnson was lauding what his company is doing, I believe, in banning plastic straws, despite no science indicating that it is a serious environmental threat or harm, and other things to virtue signal. And really that's what the Global Climate Action Summit has turned out to be. It's virtue signaling, green virtue signaling, where we all are assumed to understand that nobody can challenge or dispute their notion of the science, even though the scientific data and evidence strongly contradict it. But watching to and listening to Kevin Johnson, it reminded me, Dr. Lehr, you and I wrote a column 2 months ago that appeared in, it was the Washington Examiner, I think. It might have been the Washington Times. And it was in response to, I believe it was a New York Times article, alleging that due to global warming, due to human-caused climate change, that coffee growers in Central America could no longer grow as many coffee beans, and that they were therefore having to work extra jobs, and they can no longer make ends meet. And we looked at the data, and tell us what the data showed, and if global warming is impacting, we're often told you have to look at every incident through global warming and attribute global warming to some of it. How is global warming impacting Kevin Johnson and Starbucks coffee?
The actual data was the opposite. The problem with the coffee growers is the increase in carbon dioxide has significantly increased the coffee bean yield, which has driven the price of coffee way down, which has affected the coffee growers' income. So the data is absolutely the opposite, and I find that to be true in almost all what they call technical stories that the alarmists put out, that they're not only wrong, they're actually flipping the data upside down, which is typical. And the conference really focused more on a decarbonized world, and we must eliminate all fossil fuel energy and go entirely to wind and solar. What was never brought up is that since we started building wind turbines and solar farms, not a single fossil fuel power plant has been decommissioned as a result, because you must have 100% running backup for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun does not shine. So we have to have actually more fossil fuel plants the more wind and solar situations that we build. They never mention that. They never mention the fact that we're not talking about decarbonization. We're talking about carbon dioxide of the world. They use the word carbon to trick the public into thinking we're talking about lampblack, soot, coal dust, and things that we think of as negatively. There is no relationship between carbon and carbon dioxide other than there is a carbon molecule in a carbon dioxide molecule, but the relation between carbon and carbon dioxide is about the same as between lightning and a lightning bug. But they do this absolutely purposely, and they're working. I've been on a campaign now for a few months to stop all the learned people, such as those sitting at this table, to use the word carbon when they mean carbon dioxide. They are not synonyms by any means, but we cannot have a world run by wind and solar and renewable energy. What we're talking about is making sure that the poor people in this world never advance their standard of living with inexpensive energy, because if you look at all the numbers around the world where they're building solar farms and they're building wind turbines, the cost of energy is skyrocketing, as well as in the states here in the United States as a result. California's energy is up 25% as a result of having a great deal of renewable energy, and it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. They want to go 100% renewable energy by 2045. It isn't possible, but on the way, they're going to have a disastrously bad economy trying.
Thank you, Dr. Lehr, and we're certainly going to talk more about energy economics and costs, and most of that discussion will be tomorrow. Getting back to Kevin Johnson and Starbucks, it really struck me, because what we documented in our article, and basically what we did is we saw an article asserting some climate catastrophe. And as is almost always the case, I figured it would be the case here as well, and that's when we started researching this. The New York Times did not provide links to scientific sources or data where we could fact check what they were reporting. They reported some anecdote where some coffee farmer in Central America wasn't doing a good job and blamed global warming rather than perhaps his own farming practices. What we discovered by looking at the data is that the coffee farmers in Central America were putting out bumper crops, indeed record crops. So citing one person who wasn't doing a good job farming had little to do with global warming and much more to do perhaps with his personal skills as a coffee farmer. But it's important to point out that what we do at the Heartland Institute and throughout the skeptic universe, so to speak, is that we support what we're saying with data. And we have to, because we're fighting an uphill battle. If you watch the news, if you read the newspapers, if you listen to radio, what you're always hearing is they repeat the assertions that everyone agrees, all the science says this, but they never give you data. They never give you observations. The New York Times certainly didn't. In our article, Dr. Lehr, you and I, we linked to the actual crop data in Central America where viewers and where readers could see for themselves. We also talked about crops as a whole, because the New York Times article alluded to an assertion that it's not just coffee beans, but it's tomatoes and it's other crops. So we looked up the statistics and the data on tomato production, and then also on the largest food sources, the cereal crops, wheat, rice, maize. And we see that for virtually every crop that is grown of any importance, almost every year, you see record production set. Now, there are many factors involved, but the assertion that global warming is destroying the coffee crop will cause a decrease in food production is simply contradicted by the objective data. And that's what we do, is we present the data. And I'd like to use that as a segue, because we have Dr. Gannon here in California. And certainly you can talk. I saw you raise your finger a little bit. But I was going to segue to you anyway, because you're here in California.
Yeah.
And at the Global Climate Action Summit this morning, there were a couple assertions that wildfires here in California are being caused by global warming. Now,
Right.
you're here. You're a scientist. You're studying the climate. And so my question to you is, do we see anything unusual about this wildfire season? Do we see anything different about the way people are managing the land? Can we say, as has been asserted without scientific support this morning, that global warming is to blame for California wildfires?
Yeah, I think before I get to that, I want to make two quick points to amplify what you just said. I think science in general, be it brain surgery, genetic research, semiconductors that we all benefit from, what's important in that process of scientific discovery is the idea that people raise questions that are contrary. The skeptic plays a strong role in science that we know all around us has benefited society. But in climate, the scientists are not invited to the summit to give their view. The scientists are called names, and some of the people at the conference are well aware of this and use the name frequently. We cover the name denier. But the other thing that I find consistently missing, and it also goes to the fires in California, and I think every citizen, every person, scientific or not, I would challenge them to take the claim or the quest of asking for root cause analysis. You can look at every single phenomena that's politicized today, and you'll never find root cause analysis. Now, fires in California, we've had a steady stream of fires, very suspicious fires, I might add, but a steady stream of fires. And they replicate what happened back in the 50s as far as Santa Rosa is concerned. Santa Rosa burned to the ground in a way similar to what it did a year ago. And so one could say, well, what was the cause? Well, the high winds were the cause. Certainly, we had very good rainfall in 2016 here in California when Governor Brown declared that the drought was over, which I think wasn't exactly a politically correct AGW thing to say, but he did say that, and then proceeded, as we went in further into the big fire year of this year and last, when we had less rainfall, began to talk about the idea that this is really the new norm in California, that CO2 is causing great difficulty. What really is happening here is two factors that I can determine. And I think here at Independent Institute, there's some work going on to look further into this. But if you look at it, CO2, the increase in CO2 has generally increased the productivity of vegetation to a fairly significant level. You'll never hear at the summit, thank God we have greening of the world to the tune of an increased area of green, meaning vegetation, across the globe at the size of the continental United States. So this is rather significant. This has helped feed the world. We can feed the world on just the improvement in rice output. So why aren't we talking about that? So I think that if you look at the fires, Santa Rosa burned to the ground in 50 years ago, and it burned to the ground a year and a half ago with the same exact map. Now, one would ask the question, what did we learn from 50 years ago that should have been applied? And it's fire prevention. We don't have adequate resources. I'm not talking about firemen put in great danger. I'm talking about immediate elimination of a fire soon after it starts. We should be having an alert system. We should be having overwhelming sky resources and that cover and support the entire western United States. So I think that and for Governor Brown to blame the citizens of California for the increased fires is not only erroneous, it's totally despicable. And so I think that, you have to look at root cause analysis. Why are skeptics not being brought to the table? Why aren't climate models being assessed properly and looking at the root cause of their disparity? There are a lot of problems with these climate models. We could go on and on for hours on that. So I think that if you don't have the climate models, you don't have AGW. If you focus on root cause analysis, you give up this feedback of 3x to 8x that drives the whole danger. However, I do want to salute the people who are participating in the summit because the participation shows their dedication to a cause. What I would ask them to think about is what cause do they want to dedicate themselves to? Do they want to kill a good portion of the people in Africa? What are they really after? Are they going to push back into a poverty situation in parts of the world that will kill people and cause international strife? We have to consider this carefully.
James, can I bring up one quick point? James was talking about good references on our side, and for viewers, not ending up it. Right, that's right. Viewers, I think, should get a feeling for the number of references that support what people are saying here by going to the webpage of the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change, and that is climatechangereconsidered.org. And what you find is that those reports that are summarized by the NIPCC, they summarize thousands of studies from peer-reviewed science journals that either debunk or totally, cast doubt on the climate scare. So I'll say it again, it's climatechangereconsidered.org, and you will see literally thousands of references and very nice summaries at the beginning of every chapter. If you're not scientifically inclined, you can still understand those summaries. I use them all the time in radio interviews. I think it's the most important document in the whole climate debate.
Tom, would you give that address again?
Yeah, it's climatechangereconsidered.org.
Can I say something? You talk about the root cause analysis. I heard a very interesting talk at one of the Heartland Institute IPCC meetings, and it was a scientist from the Louis Pasteur Institute. I don't know if anybody else heard that. And what he was given was to do research and investigate on why the number of insect-driven diseases were increasing. I believe it was in Poland, in a certain area of Poland. And of course, what was the cause that they expected? The theory was man-made global warming. And so he did a very, very thorough analysis of it. And the conclusion he came up with was it was economically driven. What happens is because the economy had plummeted in that area, more people were going into the forest to gather mushrooms and sell mushrooms, and they were getting more insect-borne diseases. I mean, you have to do a careful analysis. I hope people have appreciated the fact that almost everybody here, probably 90% of our focus has been on data, scientific analysis, facts. We're not talking politics here, although politics have gotten involved. And when people use the word skeptics, I use the phrase all good scientists are skeptics. And I think the problem is that in some of the alarmist community is they've thrown out the skepticism on some of these findings, some of these models, and they don't dig deep enough. So we need to be skeptics when we look at scientific results and data.
And I'm glad that you're emphasizing the data. The federal government maintains a website. It's the National Interagency Fire Center. And if you go to their website, they provide data on wildfires. And what's very noteworthy is that if you look at the data, you will not see any increase in the frequency of wildfires in recent years or recent decades. Regarding the total number of acres burned, very little trend. You might be able to make a case for a slight increase in trend. But Dr. Gannon, as I've heard you explain in the past, that our land management practices are much different now than they used to be.
Yeah.
We don't preventatively thin out forests to decrease fuel. We also don't jump in right away and put out every wildfire that occurs like we used to 50 years ago. Back then, Smokey the Bear, you put it out right away. Now the policy is if it's not threatening population centers, you let it burn. The thing that really amazes me is that despite this change in land management policy and wildfire response, we still, according to the data, don't see an increase in wildfires. And that's the same in California. Right. Because the argument being made here, as you're well aware, is that California especially is feeling the hard effects. And California is the canary in the coal mine for global warming and wildfires. Cliff Mass, who is a scientist at, I believe it's the University of Washington, looked at the data, looked at the evidence regarding California and wildfires, and what he showed, and you can Google search Cliff Mass California wildfires, he showed that the data indicate quite clearly that there is a decline in California wildfires in recent decades, and the total acres burned is about the same because of the difference in land management practices.
Yeah.
We don't see much of a change in wildfires, except perhaps for the better, but what we do see is a change in the media coverage and the activist outrage about any wildfire that occurs for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think the whole idea of fighting fires in California today, if we're not going to manage the forests and the vegetation differently, has to be totally rethought. The idea of jumping on a fire, preventing a fire, and then jumping on a fire as soon as it starts, and having the resources to essentially eliminate it in the first 100 acres. That's a question that I think I've not heard anyone in the media, no one in the public, discussion ever say anything about that. But it's rather interesting when you look at rainfall. I had a chance to look at Modesto rainfall since 1888, and the rainfall averages in the number of years below the average has not changed since 1888. It hasn't changed from 1888 to 1950 or from 1950 thereafter. And it hasn't changed in the last 20 years when basically the temperature hasn't changed that much. I think that, when you start looking at root cause analysis and you start thinking about, well, what can I do differently? I don't just send more money to an agency. I think that's the part that people have to understand. And that's the part that is being promoted in California every single night, how brave the firefighters are, and they are indeed very brave. I ask the question, why are we putting them at great risk when we don't have to? So it is rather interesting to look at California. If you look at the two sides of California, they feel very differently about many political issues. I think that doing more root cause analysis and just having a very open discussion, California should really buck Governor Brown on this. And I might actually ask the community, would they rather have a high-speed train or would they rather have good fire protection? That's as simple a question as you can have.
And that's a high-speed train, by the way, that's coming in at a cost, construction cost, not talking the rider fares after it's built, construction cost of more than $1 million per mile. It's coming in more than double the initial projected budget. The amount of, it's per mile. It's $1 million per mile. It's over $100 billion now in total construction costs. And the cost per California household, I don't have the number at my fingertips, but it's thousands upon thousands of dollars per household to pay for this. So I don't know, would you rather have that? I think that's a good question. Tom, I'm going to let you comment, and then we're going to wrap it up, because although we've presented more science in this hour and a half than the Global Climate Action Summit has done all morning, we'd like to give them a chance to perhaps present some science of their own, and we do encourage our viewers to watch that as well, to compare the two and make up your own minds. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, for a bit of perspective, people should realize that before the Europeans came to North America, wildfires would cover enormous areas, and they would burn until they came to a natural barrier like the Mississippi, and they would cover areas equivalent to today's full states, okay? So it's not as if wildfires are anything new. They were burning and raging long before the Europeans got here.
And 100 years ago, there were fires that killed hundreds and thousands of people in places like Peshtigo, Michigan, and Cloquet, Minnesota.
Yeah. And I think
enormous fires.
I think it's also interesting to note that the Indians, when they really controlled the habitat, the environment of Yellowstone, when they would decide to leave Yellowstone for a period of time, what did they do? They lit it on fire to manage the forest. And the forest, when not managed, this is something that most people can't grok. When you don't manage a forest, it can overgrow its vegetation by as much as 6x. When that forest finally catches fire, as it did in Yellowstone eventually, or in the Northwest, what it does is it gets to such a high temperature, it sterilizes the soil. So you've got a double whammy now. You're basically eliminating the environment of the future for good long decades. And so the question now becomes, do you manage it or don't you? High-speed rail, or what do you want?
Well, thank you so much. And let me just conclude by once again thanking our panelists. From viewer left to right, we have Tom Harris, president of the International Climate Science Coalition, Dr. Richard Keene, emeritus instructor at the University of Colorado, instructing in meteorology and climate, Stan Goldenberg, a meteorologist from Miami, Florida, who is one of the scientists who flies planes into hurricane eye walls and lives to tell about it. We have Dr. Terry Gannon from the Independent Institute, a research fellow here, and Dr. Jay Lehr, science director for the Heartland Institute. I'm James Taylor, senior fellow at the Heartland Institute. We will be back tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. We're going to address many of the comments and questions that have come in. We thank you very much for those. We're going to talk a lot about economics. We're also going to talk about consensus. Is there a consensus? What role is there? And, of course, any other questions and issues that you presented and that we have time for. Thank you so much. Always check the science. Check our sources. Check the other side's sources. Truth will always win out. Have a great afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow.